Millionaire marries the woman everyone despised as a bet, but she gives him the greatest lesson. The city skyline gleamed with the golden hues of the setting sun, casting a warm glow over the glass facade of the hotel's rooftop terrace. The sound of laughter and clinking champagne glasses filled the air as impeccably dressed guests mingled. Their conversations a blend of business, gossip, and hollow pleasantries. This was the annual charity gala hosted by Victor Rodriguez, one of the wealthiest and most influential entrepreneurs in the city. The event was the epitome of luxury, where only the elite were invited, and every detail screamed opulence. From the delicate crystal chandeliers to the live string quartet playing soft melodies in the background. Victor stood near the edge of the terrace, looking out at the glittering city lights below. He wore a custom-tailored suit that fit him perfectly, exuding confidence and control. A glass of vintage champagne in his hand, he seemed every bit the part of the successful businessman he was known to be. People admired him, envied him even, not just for his wealth, but for the way he commanded every room he entered. He was handsome, charming, and at the age of 35, he had achieved what most could only dream of. Yet, despite the praise and attention, there was an arrogance about him, an almost palpable sense of superiority. To Victor, life was a series of challenges to be conquered, people to be impressed or manipulated, and tonight was no different. As Victor exchanged pleasantries with some of his high-profile guests, his closest friend, Lucas, approached him with a smirk. Lucas was the kind of friend who thrived in the shadow of Victor's success, always present at his side, enjoying the perks of being associated with someone powerful. He leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to seem conspiratorial. "Another flawless party, Victor. You never fail to impress," Lucas remarked, raising his glass. There was a sly edge to his voice, though, as if he was leading up to something more. Victor shrugged, his smile barely reaching his eyes. "Of course. It's just another evening, another opportunity to showcase what we've built." Lucas's grin widened. "You make it sound so mundane. But tell me, Victor, when was the last time you did something truly exciting? Something that wasn't just for the business or your image?" Victor raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the challenge in Lucas's tone. "Exciting? If you call dealing with billion-dollar deals and acquisitions mundane, then maybe you're right. But go on. I can tell you have something on your mind." Lucas glanced around, ensuring no one else was listening. Then he gestured subtly across the room, towards a woman standing by herself near the bar. She was dressed simply, in a modest blue dress that, while elegant, was a stark contrast to the designer gowns around her. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she held a glass of wine, seemingly lost in thought as she looked out at the view. She didn't seem to fit in with the crowd, not because she wasn't beautiful, she was, in an understated way, but because she wasn't vying for attention like the others. There was a serenity about her, a quiet confidence that set her apart. "Her name is Isabel Morales," Lucas said with a smirk. "Works at the public library downtown. Not exactly your type, is she? No designer labels, no interest in networking, just simple." Victor's gaze lingered on Isabel for a moment. His interest peaked despite himself. "And why are you pointing her out to me, Lucas?" "Because," Lucas said, leaning closer, "I bet you can't win her over. She's different from the women you usually go for. She doesn't care about money or status. In fact, I'd say she probably despises everything this party represents." Victor chuckled, a low dismissive sound. "You underestimate me, Lucas. You think I can't charm one modest librarian?" Lucas's eyes gleamed with a challenge. I'm saying it's not as easy as you think. In fact, I'm willing to make a bet. You have until the end of the month to win her over, make her fall for you. If you can do that, I'll give you that Aston Martin I've been bragging about. Victor's laughter grew louder, drawing a few glances from nearby guests. You're serious? That car is worth over 200 grand. Consider it a challenge, Victor. You like challenges, don't you? Lucas grinned, the provocation clear. Victor's eyes narrowed and he glanced back at Isabel. There was something different about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. But the bet wasn't about her. It was about proving Lucas wrong, about showing that there wasn't anyone who could resist his charm. It was about his pride. All right, you've got yourself a bet, Victor agreed, extending his hand. They shook on it, sealing a pact that neither of them could take back. Lucas gave him a satisfied nod and wandered off, leaving Victor to watch Isabel from across the room. Victor finished his drink and made his way toward the bar. As he approached, he noticed the way Isabel seemed almost oblivious to the crowd around her. She wasn't scanning the room for familiar faces or trying to catch anyone's eye. She was simply present, absorbed in her own thoughts. It was refreshing. He stood beside her, flashing his most charming smile. Beautiful night, isn't it? Isabel turned her head slowly to look at him. Her eyes, a deep brown, seemed to look right through him, as if she could see beyond the polished exterior. It is, she replied simply, taking a sip of her wine. She didn't offer her name, didn't ask for his. It was the first time in a long while that someone hadn't immediately recognized him or tried to flatter him. I'm Victor, he said, holding out his hand, undeterred by her lack of interest. Isabel, she responded, shaking his hand briefly before turning her attention back to the view. There was no spark of recognition, no indication that she knew who he was. It was as if he were just another guest at the party, no different from anyone else. Victor was taken aback, but quickly recovered, leaning casually against the bar. Do you come to these events often? She shook her head. No, not really. I'm here as a favor to a friend who works with the charity organizing it. Ah, Victor said, nodding as if he understood. I'm surprised. You don't seem like the type who enjoys these kinds of gatherings. Isabel smiled faintly. You're right, it's not really my scene, but it's for a good cause, so here I am. Victor found himself struggling to steer the conversation the way he usually did. There was no easy way in with her, no obvious angle to exploit. He decided to change tactics, opting for sincerity, or at least the appearance of it. Well, I'm glad you're here. It's nice to meet someone who isn't caught up in all the theatrics of it. Isabel's smile grew a little, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm sure there are plenty of interesting people here, Victor. You don't need to waste your time on me. Victor's confidence wavered for a brief moment. It was a strange feeling to be the one who felt dismissed, but it only made him more determined. You're hardly a waste of time, he said softly, his voice almost sincere. In fact, I'd say you're the most interesting person I've met tonight. Isabel looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. There was a flicker of something in her eyes. Skepticism, maybe, or curiosity. She set her glass down and gave him a polite smile. Thank you, Victor. It was nice meeting you, but I think I'll step outside for some fresh air. Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, more intrigued than ever. Victor found himself returning to the library every morning, drawn by a force he didn't fully understand. It started out as part of his plan. Showing up at Isabel's workplace was an easy way to get close to her. Yet, as he sat at a corner table, pretending to browse through a book, he couldn't help but notice the peaceful rhythm of the place. The scent of old books filled the air, mixing with the faint aroma of fresh coffee from the small cafe tucked into the back. It was a world so different from his, a sanctuary of quiet contemplation and learning, far removed from the cutthroat pace of his corporate empire. Isabel worked quietly, her focus unbroken as she moved between the shelves, her fingers tracing the spines of books with a kind of reverence. There was something calming about watching her, something genuine that stirred feelings Victor hadn't felt in years. He told himself it was just part of the act, a strategy to win her over, but deep down, he could sense that something had shifted within him. It was no longer just a bet. He found himself genuinely curious about her, wanting to know what made her different from everyone else in his life. One morning, after nearly a week of silent observation, he approached her at the front desk. The library was quiet, with only a few patrons scattered around, lost in their own reading. Isabel looked up as he walked over, her expression a mixture of surprise and mild annoyance. She hadn't expected him to keep coming back, and his persistence was starting to wear thin. "You again?" she said, her voice holding a hint of exasperation. "Is there a particular book you're looking for, or are you just here to keep me company?" Victor flashed his most charming smile, leaning casually against the desk. "Can't it be both? You seem to know a lot about books. I thought maybe you could recommend something for me." She gave him a skeptical look, clearly not buying his act. "I'm sure a man like you has more interesting things to do than read," she replied dryly. "But if you insist..." She turned and scanned the shelves behind her, pulling out a slim volume and handing it to him. "Try this." He took the book, glancing at the title. It was a collection of essays on philosophy. "Heavy reading," he remarked, raising an eyebrow. "You seem like someone who could use a little introspection," she replied with a small, knowing smile. Before he could respond, she walked away, leaving him holding the book. For the first time in a long while, Victor felt off balance, unsure of how to proceed. It was as if she could see right through his polished exterior down to the man beneath, the one even he wasn't sure he knew anymore. Determined not to be shaken, Victor returned the next day with the book in hand. He waited until Isabel had a free moment and approached her again. "I read it," he said simply. Isabel looked up, genuinely surprised this time. "The whole thing?" He nodded, and I have to say, it was more interesting than I expected. There's a passage about the emptiness of material pursuits that really got me thinking. Her expression softened, just a little. "I didn't think you'd actually read it," she admitted. "Most people just look at the cover and give up." "Maybe I'm not like most people," Victor said, his tone earnest. She studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. "Maybe," she conceded, "but actions speak louder than words, don't they?" He didn't have a response for that, not one that didn't feel like another line. For the first time, he realized he wanted her to see him differently, not as the arrogant millionaire everyone else saw, but as someone who could be genuine and real. The days passed, and Victor's visits to the library became a routine. He stopped trying to impress Isabel with grand gestures or clever lines, and instead focused on simple conversations. They talked about books, the weather, small things that slowly grew into deeper topics. Philosophy, the struggles of running a non-profit, the state of the world. He found himself opening up to her in a way he hadn't with anyone else, sharing stories from his childhood, memories of his late mother, and the loneliness that often crept in despite his success. Isabel listened quietly, offering her own thoughts and experiences, her responses always thoughtful and honest. She didn't shy away from challenging him, calling him out when his ideas seemed shallow or self-serving, but she did so with a kindness that disarmed him. For the first time, Victor felt seen, truly seen, not for his wealth or status, but for who he was beneath it all. But as their connection deepened, the weight of the bet began to gnaw at Victor's conscience. He had never intended for things to go this far, never expected to actually care about Isabel. It was supposed to be a game, a way to prove a point to Lucas and to himself. Yet here he was, dreading the day she would find out the truth. He knew it was only a matter of time. Lucas was the type to brag, and their mutual friends loved nothing more than a bit of gossip. Victor's internal struggle grew with each passing day. He couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on work. The thought of losing Isabel haunted him, but so did the fear of coming clean. He didn't know if she would understand, if she would see that he had changed, that his feelings for her had become real. The guilt ate away at him, but he kept putting off the inevitable, convincing himself that he needed just a little more time, that he could find the right moment to tell her. It was at a fundraising gala for a local children's charity, a rare event where the city's wealthy mingled with community leaders, that everything came crashing down. Victor had invited Isabel as his guest, wanting her to see the world he was a part of, hoping she might understand him a little better. She looked beautiful that night, dressed in a simple but elegant gown, her hair cascading down her shoulders in soft waves. Victor couldn't take his eyes off her, and for a moment he let himself believe that things might actually work out. But Lucas was there too, drinking more than he should have, and as the night wore on, he grew louder and more careless. He sauntered over to Victor and Isabel, a glass of whiskey sloshing in his hand. "You really pulled it off, didn't you?" Lucas slurred, clapping Victor on the back. "I owe you that car. Never thought you'd actually win the bet." Victor felt his blood run cold. He glanced at Isabel, her smile frozen, the color draining from her face. "Bet?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas, oblivious to the tension, laughed. "Yeah, the bet. Victor here managed to charm you, just like he said he would." "Is that true?" Isabel asked, turning to Victor, her eyes wide and filled with disbelief. Victor's throat went dry. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. He could see the realization dawning in her eyes, the hurt and betrayal flooding in as she stepped back, shaking her head. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. I thought you were different." "Isabel, please," Victor pleaded, reaching for her, but she pulled away, her expression crumpling with a pain so raw it took his breath away. Without another word, she turned and fled, disappearing into the crowd. Victor stood there, paralyzed, the noise of the party fading into a dull roar. He had won the bet, but in that moment, he realized he had lost everything that truly mattered. Victor stood frozen in place, the weight of his actions settling in like a lead blanket. The laughter and music of the party around him seemed muffled, as if it were happening underwater. He watched helplessly as Isabel disappeared into the crowd, her silhouette vanishing like a fleeting shadow. Lucas, realizing too late the gravity of what he had just revealed, muttered an incoherent apology before slinking away, leaving Victor alone in a sea of glittering, indifferent faces. For a moment, Victor couldn't move. He felt like he'd been punched in the gut, the wind knocked out of him by the sheer force of Isabel's pain. He had seen it in her eyes, betrayal, disbelief, and worst of all, the shattering of trust he had so painstakingly built. It was as though everything good he had found with her, everything real, had been a cruel mirage, now dissipated by the sharp truth of his deceit. When he finally forced himself to move, he pushed through the crowd, desperate to find her. He stumbled out onto the terrace, where the cold night air hit him like a slap to the face. He scanned the area, but Isabel was gone. The streets below were a blur of headlights and shadows, and somewhere out there she was walking away from him, perhaps forever. Victor sank onto a stone bench, his head in his hands. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly powerless. He had spent his entire career climbing to the top, believing that money and charm could solve any problem, win any battle. But now, faced with the wreckage of his own making, he realized that none of it mattered. He had betrayed the one person whose opinion truly mattered to him, all because of a stupid, reckless bet born out of arrogance and pride. In the days that followed, Victor's life unraveled. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. He barely showed up at the office, and when he did, he was a shadow of his former self, his sharp, decisive edge dulled by a fog of regret. The high-rise penthouse that once felt like a sanctuary now seemed like a prison. The silence of the empty rooms echoing with the memory of Isabel's laughter, her voice, the way she had looked at him when she thought he was someone she could trust. He called her, left voicemails, sent messages, but she didn't respond. He even went to the library, hoping to see her there, but she wasn't at her usual spot. The librarian, a kind older woman who recognized Victor from his visits, gave him a sympathetic look when he asked about Isabel. "She took some time off," she said gently. "I think she needed a break." Victor nodded, his heart sinking. He realized she was avoiding him, and he couldn't blame her. He had to respect her space, but the thought of her hurting, feeling used, made him feel sick. He couldn't escape the image of her face, the way her eyes had filled with tears when she realized the truth. One night, after hours of pacing in his apartment, Victor grabbed his coat and went out, needing to clear his head. He wandered the streets aimlessly, eventually finding himself in a part of town he rarely visited, the quieter, older neighborhood where the library was located. He ended up in front of a small cafe, the same one where Isabel used to spend her mornings before work. It was closed for the night, the chairs stacked on tables inside, but he could picture her there, sipping her coffee, lost in a book. He sank onto a bench outside, pulling his coat tighter against the chill, and for the first time in years, he let himself cry. Victor knew he couldn't go on like this. He needed to do something, to make amends, not just for Isabel's sake, but for his own. He had to prove to himself that he could be better, that he could change. It wasn't enough to simply apologize. He needed to show her that he had learned something, that her pain hadn't been in vain. He started small, volunteering at the community center, where Isabel had mentioned she used to tutor kids. At first, it felt awkward and uncomfortable. He wasn't used to this kind of work, helping organize book drives, tutoring children in reading and math. But slowly, he began to find a sense of purpose in it. The kids didn't care about his money or his status. They only cared that he was there, that he was trying to help. He started spending his weekends there, finding solace in the simple, genuine interactions he had with the kids and the other volunteers. As the weeks went by, word of Victor's volunteer work started to spread, and people who had once viewed him as nothing more than a wealthy playboy began to see a different side of him. He didn't make a show of it. In fact, he tried to keep it quiet. He wasn't doing it for recognition. He was doing it because it made him feel closer to Isabel, because it was the only way he knew how to honor the lessons she had unknowingly taught him. Meanwhile, Isabel was undergoing her own transformation. After the revelation of the bet, she had felt shattered, like the ground beneath her feet had crumbled away. For days, she couldn't bring herself to leave her apartment. The betrayal was a wound that cut deeper than she'd expected, not just because of what Victor had done, but because she had allowed herself to fall for him, to believe in the possibility of something real. She had been careful her whole life, guarding her heart, and yet he had managed to slip past her defenses. But Isabel wasn't one to wallow in her pain for long. Slowly, she picked herself up and started to channel her emotions into something productive. She threw herself into her work, expanding the literacy program she had started at the library. She began organizing workshops and outreach events, focusing on bringing books and educational resources to underserved communities. The program grew quickly, gaining attention and support from local businesses and non-profits. At one of these events, a community book fair held in a public park, Isabel was approached by a man she didn't recognize at first. He was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. It took her a moment to realize it was Victor. He looked different. Tired, yes, but also softer somehow, less polished and more real. He hesitated before speaking, his voice quiet. "I heard about what you're doing here," he said, nodding towards the booth filled with donated books. "It's incredible, Isabel." She crossed her arms, her expression guarded. "What are you doing here, Victor?" "I came to apologize," he said simply. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I needed you to know how sorry I am. I was an idiot, and I hurt you in a way I never meant to. I understand if you can't forgive me, but I had to try." Isabel studied him, her eyes narrowing as she searched his face for any sign of the old arrogance she once despised. But it wasn't there. Instead, she saw sincerity, vulnerability. It was as if he had been stripped bare, forced to confront the emptiness of his past life. "Why now?" she asked, her voice wavering. "Why come here today?" "Because I needed you to see that I've changed," he replied. "I've been volunteering, working with the kids, trying to make a difference. It's not much, but it's a start. I did it because of you, because you made me realize how hollow my life was. I know it might be too late, but I wanted you to know that you made a difference. You gave me the greatest lesson I've ever had." Isabel's eyes softened, filling with unshed tears. She took a deep breath, fighting the urge to give in to the rush of emotions flooding through her. She had spent so long building walls, but now, seeing him like this, it felt like they were starting to crack. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she whispered. Victor nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand. I don't expect you to, but I'm willing to wait, as long as it takes, to prove that I'm not the man I used to be." Isabel held his gaze for a long moment, before finally nodding. "All right," she said softly. "We'll see." They stood there in silence, the noise of the park fading away, and for the first time in months, there was a glimmer of hope, a fragile, tentative spark of something new.